specifically for this conversation, we're focusing on child and youth participatory research methodologies. And one of the reasons we decided on this particular issue area is an area that all our partners, which Yana will introduce shortly, have worked on. But it's something that's come up in our conversations too, with faculty affiliates, but also within the broader sector, whether it's research or programming or funding. There's a renewed focus on participatory methods, whether it's in funding and programming. I do want to note that it's, of course, this work has been happening, particularly around research, for 30 plus years, and this is very much building on the work that Joe Boyden and among others have done. It's nothing new, but we wanted to refocus the energy on these conversations.
First, we have the AfriChild Center, affiliated with Makerere University in Uganda, and is represented by Claire, who will be presenting, I feel like amongst a few other staff as well. So maybe you could just wait to say hello if you're part of AfriChild. I see a few cameras are off, but and you know, they have quite a large team of researchers these days, with a focus on uptake of evidence on child well-being for policy, on mentorship and growth of early to mid-career researchers. And they have a variety of recent studies on culturally relevant evidence for early childhood development, building evidence on livelihoods and economic empowerment, and work on mental health in Uganda, but also regionally. And in their research, they have a big focus on participatory methods, and Claire is kind of the driver of that. So we're excited to hear from her in a bit.
Greetings from AfriChild. A couple of my colleagues are one. Well, I think I have is Jude and Stella, Dr. Stella. Yeah. So thank you for the opportunity to share. I'll take a minute or two to tell you about AfriChild. AfriChild is a child-focused research institution hosted in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Makerere University. It was primarily established to generate evidence that could inform policies and programs to improve the well-being of children in Africa. So our aspiration is Africa-wide. And the institutions that came together, it evolved out of a loose formation that had 6 institutions that included Makerere University, which is the largest public university in Uganda, Columbia University, the CPC. It's good to see Lindsay here. Was very instrumental in establishing the AfriChild Center, Child Fund, TPO, UNICEF, and the Ministry of Gender, which is the line ministry in charge of children's affairs. I felt I would give this background, and in my next slide, you will see I want to provide context as to what shapes our participatory work. So by virtue of who we are as a center, our research has a must-have utility for policy and practice. So there's a change goal in mind with every research, right from design. 2, we aim to do research that acknowledges community capacity and knowledge. So if we go into our communities, a street context, we are not the experts. The people that live there are the experts. And lastly, because we are AfriChild, research that amplifies children's voices and lived experiences. So having this at the back of our mind shapes our approach to some of the research I'll be referencing, which was conducted in 2015, between 2015 and 2017. And we've gone on to build, in many ways, to build on those engagements with youth researchers that we worked with them, so that we can have, you know, what Clara just alluded to, a relationship, a continuing relationship with the same people. So I'm happy to share some of our reflections on these methods with children and youth in Uganda. Next slide. So in our practice, and I'm sharing mostly from experience, when does the participation come in? And from our practice, we've learned, and we are continually increasing the extent to which children and youth get to participate right from project inception, once we have the idea. Unfortunately, we still have the upper hand in coming up with the idea, in securing the funding, in holding the grants. So we try to engage them as early as possible during protocol design, during agreeing on methodology, we have learned with our first study, which was looking at violence against children in children that are outside of family care. We went to these youth with methodologies and said, okay, we're doing photo voice, we're doing this, we're doing this. Now, along the way, we've learned that we take the whole range of what we have and discuss this with the youth, with children, and see what they want to prioritize, what suits their context. Because, for example, children out of family care are in the streets. What does it mean if we hand them a camera? And so that context shapes how we are going to implement the research itself. For example, they told us how we can't go with this camera alone on the streets. They'll grab it, people will grab it. The streets are dangerous. And so they said maybe one of the research team members can accompany a child as they go around taking pictures for safety. Probably that's not how it's done elsewhere, but in this context, this is how they guided. And so from project inception to, prioritizing what methods make sense to them, what kind of person should lead the interviews, who do they think, and this is when we're working with youth as peer researchers, but also as advisors on an advisory board or an advisory committee. And then during the research for this particular study, we had youth as peer researchers lead the interviews, lead life history interviews, lead roving focus group discussions, because we're walking in the streets and they're leading the discussion with their peers because their peers trust them more than they would trust us. And then through data analysis, building on again onto what Clara, and I'm glad I get to speak after Clara, involving children or young people in data analysis. We tried this out. I'd never seen this done anywhere. We did try it out, and we had a joint coding process, making sense of these findings. And I remember clearly one of the examples I always give is in the streets, they refer to police in the local language as dogs. So if we were to just collect data and analyze, we would think dogs present a risk to these children's safety. But what they meant was police. Would never have known this if we didn't have them helping us to make sense of this data. And also through the validation, where at that point they get to identify opportunities for action, even at individual level, or and how they can support their peers in different circumstances. And then lastly, through research communication, again, we had a high-level event with the First Lady there, and the children from the streets were telling their story, were disseminating the findings. So between the analysis and the communication, we had so much data. And so we asked them, what do you communicate urgently? What is of priority to you? And so they highlighted the stories. So even in the publications we've since written, what we have, what they chose to prioritize and not what we thought was important. Then next, Diana. Okay, so we like to say we are pushing the limits, and that's the title from one of our papers, Pushing the Limits of Child Participation in Research. Specifically, really, I've already talked about a lot of this during developing the research idea, the concept, shaping it, study design, either as peer researchers or as advisory board or survivor-led advisory board in some contexts, and then in determining which methods will work and how do we contextualize them. That's another thing. One of the methods we were using was what they call river of life, or journey of life. And usually we do this with individuals. But these boys on the street said, no, we want to do it as a group. We didn't know how this exactly would work out. Like, no, we have shared experiences, we know each other. So we tried that out, and we got very interesting and rich data. So it takes humility, it takes, once you're over the first shock of, okay, how does this work? And at the same time, recently we were trying to discuss the same method with a group of teenage moms. And they said, this is a very sensitive topic. We are talking about sexual violence, so we can't have this in a group. So it's the same approach, but applied differently based on context and guidance from the people that are involved. And then through research translation, intervention design, those are some of the specific stages in the research process during which we engage young people. Next, Anna. So yeah, I put this here really to emphasize the importance of having them lead. Since we are saying youth-led or child-led, having them lead or participate to the extent possible in meaning making. Otherwise, if they're just collecting data or just giving us data, we miss out something. We miss out something. We don't complete the cycle of meaningful participation. So next. And so even when we are reporting or communicating these findings, I put this here. On one end, we have children trying to make sense of pictures they've drawn about their community, about risks in a certain community. And then on the other hand, we have a publication in a journal. And I wanted to pose a question. How accessible is this publication to the children? And many times we've asked ourselves, okay, yeah, it's good. I know their names, especially the peer researchers, their names appear on the publications. And we're like, yeah, that's a good thing. We had to go through a lot of challenges navigating this with the journal, saying we have peer researchers, they don't fit your typical co-author, but they participated in every part. They have every right to be, to co-author this paper as much as the rest of us. So we had a lot of back and forth, and then they eventually allowed and said, okay, that's a win. Then we say, but wait a minute, will they access this? Even if they access it, does it make sense to them? Does a publication, okay, does their name appear in a publication mean anything to them? So while we are trying to push the limits, we also find there are some other questions we have to answer along the way. How do we make this picture on the left make sense, resonate through, so that the knowledge product we have at the end makes sense for the people for whom this, assuming, and I'm believing we do this for the children and for the young people. How do we make it make sense for them? Next. Yeah, so another reflection really is trying to find a balance between research practice and duty of care. In the different contexts we work, we'll find that sometimes they have priorities. The young people we are engaging in our research have priorities that are not very close to the research priorities. And so how do we strike a balance so that we are not extractive? We're not just going there and doing our research and leaving them. And so we're learning to provide support. One, when we work with young people as peer researchers, to have a psychologist, someone to follow up and support them, because some of these were on the streets, they get triggered every time. We are re-traumatizing them every time we are having them lead conversations. They can relate to certain stories, and at the end of the day, they would come and say, I don't feel well, I don't feel good. That story is like mine. And so we had them do daily journaling, and then have someone check in with them, a psychologist check in with them to see how can we support you? Do you need to speak to someone? And many other ways. Next, I'm running out of time. I think the power issue is there. It's self-explanatory. We still hold the power. It's our research, it's our grant, it's our this, it's our idea in the first place. So being mindful of that and learning to take on, I'm trying to say to be humble. I don't know if that's correct English. In Uganda, it's correct English. To be humble, take on the humility to really listen, to really prioritize what makes sense to the people we are working for. Actually, in my notes, I had a question that asks whose research. As researchers, we'll always be asking ourselves, whose research? Is it my research? Is it for me to publish and get my name out there and get a promotion? Is it to change lives, to improve lives, to have impact? And having that in mind then shapes how far we go and how we explore possibilities within the methodologies that we have. Next. Yeah, trust. this is another critical aspect. Trust building is something we've learned to build in time for. Recently, a colleague was asking me, can you share some resources that you have for trust building? How do you do it with young people? I said, we don't have resources. We don't have toolkits. So it looks different with every context. With children on the streets, it looks different. And you can't be sure how long it will take. Sometimes it's just sitting and hanging out with these people before we even start talking research. For about 3 to 6 months. With the study with street connected children, it took us 6 months to break through, to get to that point where people are comfortable enough to begin to share their stories and they're beginning to trust. With some, it takes 3 months. But then how do we explain this to a funder? We have a deadline, we have a research that is supposed to happen in 9 months or in 18 months. So how do we explain that we need to first get to that point where, you know, we are comfortable with built trust. We've tried to manage a bit of the power relation. So it takes time, it takes patience, it takes flexibility in funding. And I think it's our duty to begin to push back or to negotiate for some of these things in our research grants, to budget for it, not to assume that first month inception will finish the trust building then and then, you know, hit the ground running with our research. Next.
And just 2 minutes, Claire. Oh, yeah,
that's really my last slide. And I intended to really, considering all these tensions that emerged from Clara's presentation and from mine, issues around navigating how we think, how academia thinks, how we structure knowledge production, navigating ethical issues around compensating young people. I mean, young people and children, when we work with them as co-researchers, those are many issues to navigate. And I want to leave us with a question again: whose research is this? If it is meant to benefit the children, how are we ensuring that it makes sense to them up to the end, that we are not ending at publishing and presenting in a conference that they will never go to, or they will never hear of or get a chance to hear what happened? How are we making it make sense? One of the ways we've done that is through having youth briefs or handouts at the end of the study. Things that we agree on: what actions can you take, what can your peers do, how can you support your peers, or what resources are available, so that we are not just extracting the knowledge and publishing and leaving them hanging. And so this last quote is from our paper. We'll share the papers with Yana to share with the rest of the team. From that study, our conclusion was that the narratives we got from the children and what they prioritized highlight their understanding and their interpretation of violence in their lives. That means if we are to prevent violence against children who are outside family care, in this case, the ones who are working within the research, we have to value their input. We have to value their participation, their role, their meaning making. We have to center their perspectives in what we are aiming to do, because at the end of the day, they are the ultimate beneficiaries of this research. Thank you. I'm happy to engage more.
We also have Puskapa affiliated with Universitas Indonesia, who's represented by a few people here. I see Clara, who will be presenting, as well as Weedy and a few other staff, so you can feel free to wave as well. But, you know, so their work has largely included projects that work on system strengthening, including birth registration and legal identity, access to services for vulnerable groups. But they've also recently studied youth involvement in the climate change movement. And they also have a big focus on children and young people's participation in research. So we're excited to hear from them shortly.
Okay, thank you, Yana, and thank you, Gazal, for the lovely introductions. Hi, everyone. I'm Clara Siagian. I'm currently a senior researcher at Puskapa at Universitas Indonesia. Hi to you all from this part of the world. And it's around 8 p.m. here, so please be understanding if sometimes I may fade off or something, like zone out a little bit. But I'll I'm looking forward to the discussions and conversations, and I'm here. I'm joined with by my colleague Vidi, head of research in Puskapa, and one of our junior colleagues, Kodri, here as well. So those are the two people who are also part of um, the research that I would focus on for this presentation. So, okay, so we next slide, please. In Puskapa, we recently we have a more focus on participatory research with children, and we're trying to kind of look at the ways how participatory then be transformed into participations in real life. So that's the visions, that's the aim. Our recent work that's sort of relevant to these conversations, we published a handbook on participatory research with children, and Lindsay here was part of it. She kindly reviewed it and give a lot of comments that sort of helped to improve the handbook, and we're really happy that we found a lot of people from that we didn't know kind of use it for either their work or their syllabus in the university. So yeah, that's one of the things that we are also really keen on sharing with you. So I'll send the details if you are interested in any of these publications. So we also work in 2020, we published Children in Cities. We use asynchronous correspondence with children. It was during the first few months of COVID-19 to understand the experience of children and young people in different cities in Indonesia. We also, as Sienna mentioned, work on a research on understanding youth engagement activisms in climate and environmental issues. And then we also part of the submissions from Indonesia to G20 Forum in 2021 on urban and youth. We put forward youth aspirations, voices, and concerns as part of the government submissions. We're also currently working on a research project that I will focus on today on understanding climate change vulnerabilities and injustice from the standpoint of children and young people. So let me dive into that particular research. So a bit about the research. The research was conducted in 3 locations facing multiple threats of climate crisis in Pekalongan, Jakarta, and Pontianak. The fieldwork was over the course of 3 weeks. Before going further, I want to acknowledge my colleagues here, especially Vidi, who work on this project. This project is funded by Australian government through their new initiative to bridge knowledge productions and collaboration between Australian and Indonesian institutions. For this study, we partner with Australian National University with Dr. Firman Witular. The study is a mixed method, but Puskapa take the responsibility of not only managing the project, but also to conduct the qualitative part of it and the scoping. So the study, our qualitative part involves children and young people aged 13 to 22 years old of mixed gender with methods tailored to accommodate the research questions and the children's needs and preferences. For instance, we do a lot of community tour, and these are some of the pictures that the children participants took, and then we discuss this. We use Google Maps, taking and discussing pictures that they took of environmental changes, and you'll see some of the pictures of the activities throughout the presentation. Next slide. So in the spirit of honesty and sharing concerns, worries, and doubts, my presentations would sort of divide it into 2. So I'll give descriptions on how we in Puskapa strive to be participatory, and then later on I'll talk about how we struggle to be participatory, and probably it will sort of spark some discussions, and maybe I would love to hear if some of these concerns, worries, and questions resonate with also from other affiliates or from Imagina or AfriChild as well. So next slide. First, we embed the participatory principle at the core of this research. We embark from standpoint and intersectionality theory. We acknowledge that children and young people occupy a different, if not less powerful, position in the society. From this different standpoint, they experience and understand the world, including climate change, differently from adults. We also recognize that children and young people from certain identities, background, and gender face divergent, if not heightened, risks and challenges in relations to climate change. That's why the study focused on these populations of children and young people that we think are at the forefront of climate change vulnerabilities and probably have less resources to mitigate and to adapt. Next slide. So our research design is, of course, centers on children and young people. So the other methods sort of support these findings coming from participatory research with children and young people. So we center their experience and opinions. We crafted and customized a series of methods and activities to facilitate children's and young people's stories and views, to help them articulate and express their ideas, emotions, and thoughts. We made these activities as flexible as possible to cater to different needs and circumstances. So in some locations, they love to do community tour. Others, it's quite, it's not too feasible to do that. So we print out a Google view of their community and then talk about nooks and crannies of their places. What are the changes that they experience in this neighborhood? So we also try to make a research plan that follows children's schedule and preference, and we found out they're really, really busy for a lot of things, not only for school, and we try to respect that. We also have a research protocol that is guided and informed by situated ethics. What are ethical in one place might not be ethical in other place. What are ethical for a new institutional review board may not be ethical for the community. So we try to negotiate that and try to take cues as much as possible from children and young people. Next slide. So yeah, as part of our disseminations plan, and we're still doing analysis, but we're thinking ahead of the dissemination plan. We prioritize returning back to children and young people as well as their communities. 5 minutes, sorry. Yes. As their communities compared to, for example, government or donors. We will strive to make findings and analysis accessible to children and young people. We want to provide space for them to react, respond, add, validate, argue, or even disagree with the study. We see accountability as the first critical step to the ideal of impact. Next slide. And this is how we struggle to be participatory. Next slide. We're still the one who decided the topic of interest with the broad directions from the donor and funding. Some children and young people admittedly may not think that climate change is the most pressing issues in their lives and worth researching for. Even some participants may feel that things like employment, education, and security are more important than environment and climate change. Then how do we approach these differences between researcher or funders' priorities with the priorities of children and young people? Next slide. We are the one who came up with the methodologies that made sense to us according to our capacity, time, and budget. We can't help but thinking in Puskapa, but maybe there are more effective and engaging methodologies, or we could have conducted this in a longer period of time to truly understand the children's experience and views and to give them more space to express themselves. So this is where we also struggle to be participatory. Next slide. Okay, 2 minutes. All right, I'll try to be very brief. We did not engage children and young people as co-facilitator or co-researcher and in analysis as well. But is it truly the ideal that we strive for in participatory research? If so, how do we do that? Engage them in analysis in a way that minimize or annihilate the risk of exploiting them or putting too much intellectual demand on them. Furthermore, we find that while children and young people are experts of their lives, they do not have formal knowledge that help to put their views and experiences and opinions into a bigger context and a more complete picture. And I can tell you the example of this, but in the interest of time, I will keep going to the next slide. So whose analysis? Next slide, please. We cannot, as of yet, offer them a certainty of a long-term engagement, although we see ethics, being ethical and participatory as an evolving and empowering relations. We don't have a long-term engagement with them as of yet. Its nature and time frame and in the extent beyond the funders' period, the funding period. At the same time, in a short period of time conducting this research project, we recognize and realize a certain duty of care as researchers. At the end of our fieldwork, we gave a brief sessions where we explained climate change, and it made a lot of participants being angry and want to sort of like do something about it. We see the need to help children and young people to find their agency, direct their anger and concerns, and to keep informing them about this issue. While we strive to center our disseminations on children and young people and their communities, we are still struggling to find resources and format to nurture an evolving but ongoing relations with them, and where we can learn and teach each other and in the process empower them. So next slide, the last one. While we strive to direct our accountability to participants first and foremost as part of our process to deliver impact, we are still figuring out ways to move the needle in terms of turning our research findings and recommendations into tangible actions and outcomes. The problem remains, given the difficult task of changing structure, policy and programs, especially in regards to climate change. And as we move from one funding to another, how possibly can we be even more accountable to our participants? So these are the questions that we are wrestling with, and I hope that we can kind of have discussion on that and learn from each other. Looking forward to your comments and discussion. Thank you.
And finally, last but not least, we have Imagina, who is affiliated with Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, who's represented by Arturo, Juliana, and Liliana, who will be presenting. And you can feel free to wave as well. But they're also working on a number of different research projects, including measuring the impacts of adverse childhood experiences on children's health, interventions to prevent mental health disorders among newly arrived girls, and participatory data collection with displaced adolescents. So these are only a handful of their initiatives, but we're also looking forward to hearing from them.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Liliana. It's really nice to have this opportunity to share a bit of our working process. So, well, you probably are aware that adversity and childhood is an important topic and is a global public health concern. It's something that affects children's health and well-being in very stringent ways. So we are aware of the relevance of this topic in our context here in Colombia. We are also aware of some research gaps that I'm going to talk about later on. So that was the reason why I designed a mixed method study in Colombia in order to better understand what kind of positive and adverse childhood experiences are specific to our context and assess the potential health impacts. So, well, I'm sure you're familiar with the term ACEs, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. These are defined as difficult, stressful, and potentially traumatic experiences that occur during childhood. such as household challenges, poverty, different types of violence. Adversity in childhood is associated with adverse health outcomes, particularly in adulthood. So, for example, there are a lot of evidence showing that those who have experienced several ACEs are more likely to have long and very complex health conditions, such as cardiovascular diseases, mental health issues, including cancer. So the next, please. So apart from this group of ACEs, there is also a group of positive experiences that might buffer the negative impacts of adversity. Unfortunately, this group of experiences are less explored by scholars and include, for example, a sense of feeling safe and care at home, having at least one good friend. Food security is another positive experience, but unfortunately, this group of experiences are not frequently explored. The next, please. So, well, probably you know that ACEs research production is massive, particularly in the global north. And this is understandable because it's a public health concern and the health effects associated to adversity are devastating. However, this body of research has some limitations. So the first one, or a key limitation, is that most studies draw on quantitative research approaches, which means that there is not a clear picture of the biographical and the individual impacts of adversity. A second limitation is that most studies draw on adults' accounts of their childhood experiences. So children's own experiences and views are not explored. And a third limitation is that available research doesn't often explore the positive experiences. So they, as I mentioned before, they are more focused on adversity. So we are aware of these gaps, and for that reason, we designed a mixed method study with a strong qualitative and participatory component, because we want to generate local data on both positive and adverse childhood experiences. Our study, in a nutshell, has 3 key stages. The first one is a social diagnosis, where we explored, together with children and young people here in Bogota, their understandings of both positive and adverse childhood experiences. So here we explored the kind of terms they use when talking about adversity, their aspirations for this kind of research around adversity. We also explored the potential challenges that we could face in next stages of the study. That was the first one, the social diagnosis. The second stage, no, it's the previous one. The second stage is a quantitative data generation fieldwork here we have a national survey. We want to implement a national survey informed by all the data we generate in the social diagnosis. And we want to assess hair cortisol levels. Cortisol is a key biomarker that has the potential to give us some information about, or some relevant data about the biological impact of chronic exposition to stress. So we want to explore if there is some sort of potential about measuring hair cortisol levels. So the idea with this quantitative fieldwork is to paint a picture of the prevalence of PACEs in Colombia, what types of experiences are more frequently experienced by the children and young people we are going to survey, and potentially also explore further the mental health impact of this group of both positive and adverse experiences. And finally, in the third stage, we will conduct some targeted interviews with children, young people, to better understand the lived experience of adversity. As I mentioned before, this is a big limitation of the kind of available studies. there is not enough evidence about the lived experience, the kind of biographical impact that have adversity on people's lives. At this point, we also want to do some more real kind of, real-time collaboratively work with children and young people. So we want to do some workshops and public engagement activities to co-analyze and co-interpret data generated from the social diagnosis and the quantitative fieldwork to draw some recommendations for policy and practice, but by working in collaboration with children and young people. So in relation to the social diagnosis, which is the previous slide, this is just like some findings about the social diagnosis that I want to share with you. We identified some context-specific experiences that are not routinely included in ACEs and PCEs scales. We found that social isolation, concerns about parents' safety, noise, pollution, and child labor were frequently experienced by the children and young people that we work with in the social diagnosis. So this is something important because, as I mentioned, these kind of experiences are not commonly explored by traditional scales. So we found that these experiences are something that affect children as well, particularly here in Colombia. In relation to the positive experiences, children talk about having time and opportunities to unwind and relax and being heard and supported. They value a lot these kind of spaces to talk about their emotions, to talk about their concerns without any kind of judgment. So we found that this is something positive for them. The next, please. So apart from the social diagnosis that we already done, we also completed recently a small pilot study of the quantitative fieldwork. We did this with 88 participants from a big neighborhood here in Bogota. And here we found 3 main ACEs. So children spoke of their concerns about, again, their parents' safety. They talk about loneliness and social isolation, parental separation. It was something that they also talk about. So these 3 main ACEs were the kind of important findings at this point. In relation to the positive childhood experiences profile, we see that positive thinking, feeling cared at home, and having at least 3 meals a day were commonly experienced by our participants. So yeah, that's the one. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's the slide. I was talking about this slide. The next, please. That was the positive childhood experience profile. Yeah. Well, this is just to show you that our research colleagues in laboratory at Universidad de los Andes is processing all the hair samples at the moment. So we hope to have results from this hair cortisol level analysis by next week. So after that, we will be able to start making some comparison between our data from the survey, the pilot survey, and results from this analysis. So we hope to have some interesting findings soon. So what's next? We are happy because we managed to ensure funding to do the quantitative fieldwork. We got funding from MQ Research, Mental Health Research, which is a big NGO based in London. So so we are about to start all the process of contract and so on with them. But fortunately we have funding for the qualitative fieldwork. but we are still actively looking for funding to cover the quantitative fieldwork, which is the massive chunk in our study. So we hope this presentation help us, I don't know, draw the attention of potential learners or funders or and yeah, I think that's the last slide. And yeah, feel free to get in touch if you have any question or comment or whatever.